So I also went to the Punjab Military Museum, which was officially called the Punjab State War Heroes Memorial Museum. I have to say, it was a weird museum because it was like the place was half finished, but in terms of the exhibits itself, they were very good. You had lots of tanks. Interestingly, you could see how India was non-aligned because they'd Soviet tanks, they'd American tanks, they'd everything, whereas Pakistan then mainly had American tanks. So a lot of tanks on display, particularly from the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War. Now, the museum was good, but it was extremely biased, to say the least. There was also, interestingly, the biggest sword in the world is actually there. But it's weird because it's not actually in Amritsar. It's like in between Amritsar and the border, kind of in the middle of nowhere. So I had to get a tuk-tuk out. And even that was crazy. When I was getting the tuk-tuk back into Amritsar, the guy was just like, oh, I need to stop off. And we literally stop off in this like village in the middle of nowhere near the Pakistan border, and he's just like picking up some goods from his mate. I'm just sitting there in the tuk-tuk like, what is going on? Like, everyone staring at me, all the kids and everything. So yeah, that was an interesting experience. But yeah, all the captured Pakistani tanks were either American or British. You had Pattons, Centurions, Shermans, bit of everything. India, meanwhile, as it was technically non-aligned during the Cold War, it had equipment from both sides in the Cold War. So the Soviet Union, the Americans. So a bit of a mix, which for any military nerd is certainly an interesting museum to visit. The language used in the museum was very interesting, and obviously I wouldn't know too much about Indian and Pakistani history, but you could clearly tell it was biased. So, like, I'll just read out what some of the exhibits said. So basically, a theme was the idea of India, which I mentioned in a previous video. So that's that India kind of accepts all religions in pursuit of Indian nationalism, this idea of India, whereas Pakistan is essentially a Muslim state, is the guts of the argument. Some of the exhibits, what they said, like this one, said independent India was born in battle fighting the First Indo-Pakistani War in 1947-48 for sustaining its sovereignty and the idea of India. This concept is thousands of years old, and India adapted to its sustenance, inclusivity and vision with sense and sensibility. India took independence in its stride. This even as Pakistan started on a self-initiated path of destruction by falsely claiming Kashmir as its own territory. The surrogate war started and lost in 1947-48 using Kabyle raiders led by Pakistani army regulars left its illegal desire to possess Kashmir unrequited, a dream that remains rancid 70 years later. So this is the introduction to the museum. It starts right from goes into British colonial history. You see what I think it's meant to be a British soldier getting crushed by an elephant. And it seems that every battle against the British, India seemed to win, which I can get on board with, but I somehow doubted the narrative. And then mainly what I was interested in, because I didn't know too much about it, was the modern history between Pakistan and India after partition. But that's the opening for the bit when it gets into independence. So here's another one talking about a feisty Kashmiri who died as a martyr in defense of India. And it says about what was done to him. It said he was cruelly tortured to death with the idea of India on his tortured, split, bloodied lips. Then the next part is mainly about incursions by China on the Indian-Chinese border. That bit was just very anti-communist generally. The next part refers to the Battle of Thermopylae.
This is Sparta!
Which, if you ever ever seen the movie 300 is obviously a fictionalized version of it. Completely over the top, basically, where 300 Spartans stood against a much bigger Persian army in 480 BC. Basically, this part compared several Indian battles to the siege of Thermopylae or the Battle of Thermopylae, such as Saragarhi, which was against the British in 1897. So, quick correction, I incorrectly assumed that the Battle of Saragarhi was against the British, considering that the museum is very pro-Indian nationalism. But interestingly, it was actually the final stand of 21 Sikh British Indian soldiers for the British Indian Army stood against 10,000 Afghan tribesmen. 450 of the tribesmen were killed and the 21 Sikhs were killed. I find this particularly interesting because I don't think a soldier that, say, won the Victoria Cross fighting for the British Army, an Irish soldier, would be celebrated in the same way or glorified. I know in Collins Barracks in Dublin, Irish soldiers that won the Victoria Cross fighting in the British Army, they are mentioned. There is a section about them, but I don't think they're certainly glorified or celebrated in the same way in Ireland, whereas it's highlighted as an example of the resilience and toughness of soldiers from the Punjab, even if it was for the colonial British Indian Army, which I found very interesting. And then it was back to talking about wars with Pakistan, so Kashmir. And the next part said, Kashmir was an unfinished agenda for Pakistan, notwithstanding the lies it has fed its people about having won the 1947-48 war. What I find interesting is, I don't know if they even can get visas. They might be able to get visas, but I think it's very difficult. Either way, you won't have many people from India traveling to Pakistan. You won't have many people from Pakistan traveling to India. So this extremely biased museum will likely never be seen by anyone from Pakistan. Then any Pakistani soldiers, dioramas and attacking civilians with rifle bullets. Then another interesting aspect was probably one of India's greatest victories against Pakistan was in 1971, which led to the formation of Bangladesh. East Pakistan became Bangladesh. I'll talk about Indira Gandhi in a previous video, but she was the Prime Minister at the time. So basically, the museum hyped up like every Indian Prime Minister, and then it wouldn't even mention Indira Gandhi by name. They hyped up the 1971 war, what a great victory it was, but didn't even mention her by name, didn't show any pictures of her, because obviously there was the attack on the Golden Temple in 1984 and her subsequent assassination. So that's obviously a bit of a taboo in the Punjab, because the Punjab has a huge Sikh population and was seen as an attack on the Punjab. I actually only found one picture of her in a newspaper on like a wall collage, which I think that was meant to be there. I think that was left in by accident because it's a really small, tiny photo. And only because I was looking out for it did I notice. I love some of the write-ups. So there's this write-up that said, the needlessly optimistic Pakistani plan was to have breakfast at Langawala, lunch at Jaisalmer and dinner at Jodhpur. All that they actually had caused the Pakistanis was severe indigestion. Love it. But even there's some crazy stuff. So there's a diorama and it depicted Indian soldiers breaking into dance after the Pakistanis were decimated during the Battle of Longawala. It was classic army air synergy. So they're after like burning a load of tanks and they're there dancing outside the tanks, and then they're bragging about it in the museum.
And the 47th Infantry Brigade moved in to establish a bridgehead. The Pakistani defense strategy in the area,
which, think of that what you will, particularly from the Punjab, some of the Punjabi soldiers are historically some of the fiercest, toughest soldiers in the British Indian Army and subsequently the Indian Army. As I mentioned before, the Sikhs, they're kind of like a warrior people. They don't take any shit. I do want to acknowledge that, but the museum itself, it was just, as I said, it was quite biased, and even there was like these disco lights everywhere for some reason. But I don't want to undermine or disrespect soldiers from the Punjab. I don't mean to do that. I'm just saying what I saw. And that is very interesting, the museum, to say the least. But even there was a part, and it was like threatening surrender or destruction, and the museum was highlighting that it was in perfect Urdu, which is what they speak in Pakistan. And this kind of feeds into the impression I got in the museum almost that India is the moral high ground because they're religiously pluralistic, they accept different religions, and even that they ask for surrender in Urdu. They're willing to facilitate the Urdu-speaking Pakistani soldiers because it's a written message, written differently as far as I know. And I'm not judging either way, but that's the impression I got from the museum. It goes right up to the Kargil War, 1999, recent history. So it was a very good museum in terms of size, in terms of what it covered. It covered so much in terms of the exhibits itself, plenty of different weapons, plenty of different tanks and stuff, but I just found it was very biased. So I would certainly, if you're into military history or want to learn more about the Punjab and you're in Amritsar, to make the effort to get a tuk-tuk out, it's definitely well worth it. But yeah, it was extremely biased. I suppose a lot of museums are always going to be very biased. No such thing as an unbiased source, but I thought this was very blatant. Even to sum up, and I think this refers to the Kargil War. I'm not sure it might refer to another war. I didn't footnote, but either way, it's the end of the museum sums up and says, loss becomes a statistic of pride and heroic sacrifice. If you remember that our Indian brave hearts died, were wounded while protecting the idea of India and winning, Pakistan, of course, being driven by religion, had no idea of Pakistan to fight for, having lost their fourth successive war against India. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. Yet again, feeds into this idea of India and that Pakistan has no such idea, that they're loyal to their religion and that's it, that there's no idea or national identity, so to say, except Islam, is the impression I got that the museum was trying to portray. Another thing funny about the museum is when you get there to buy your ticket, they have like a lot of places in India, as a foreigner you have to pay more, and I looked at the nationality on the ticket and it said that I was American. She never asked where I was from, but she just assumed I was American. So I suppose at least she didn't think I was British. Shows that times have changed. I'd say 30 years ago probably would have just naturally assumed I was British. But yeah, she assumed I was American. So maybe it's the baseball caps.